We are facing a crisis. It's not a refugee crisis. It's not about the numbers of people. It's about the system that is no longer coping. We have a chronically underfunded international organisation trying to protect and assist refugees. Too many refugees are finding themselves in limbo for too many years. Here we are looking at Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia. I want to use this slide, this graphic, to explain what you are looking at and what you are not seeing. Let's see what the data are about. The most important thing to explain to you is that what you are seeing here is individual refugees. Each dot is an individual refugee. Now, it's very easy for us to become swamped by numbers, to lose the human touch when we think about large numbers and see these sorts of graphics. Don't forget what a refugee is. A refugee is a man, a woman, a child, fleeing conflict, fleeing persecution, fleeing for their lives. Refugees, by definition, lose their homes. Refugees, by definition, lose access to their livelihood, to healthcare, to education. Refugees, almost by definition, face violence and discrimination during the journeys they undertake and when they arrive in some of the countries to which they're going. Think about the individual experience, understand what individuals are experiencing, and then see the numbers of people we're speaking about. At that individual experience multiplied by 20 million, which is where we are now in terms of the numbers of refugees. The yellow dots are people leaving their countries, the red dots are people arriving in other countries. So you can follow the tone, the colour, and see the directions in which people are moving. And this is very interesting. Look, Liberia, people are leaving Liberia around 2003, 2004 into Côte d'Ivoire. There's a flip, and people start fleeing Côte d'Ivoire into Liberia. There's a dynamic here that we have to understand. Refugee flows, I think, are very dynamic when they move in these sorts of parts of the world. What are we not seeing? We're not seeing internal displacement. More people flee inside their countries than cross borders, but of course we tend to focus on refugees. We haven't got a picture of how many people stay for how long in the countries to which they're going, but there's a very important message here. More and more refugees are spending longer and longer periods of time in exile, in camps, in limbo, in warehouses, and that clearly is not fruitful either for them or the societies in which they're being hosted. I think another thing we are not seeing here clearly is return. There aren't as many returns as we would hope in the international system at the moment, but some refugees do indeed go home. The final thing we're not seeing, and Achim will speak, I'm sure, more about this, we're not looking at migration. We're not looking at people who are moving for work, or because of poverty, or because of food insecurity, or because of the many other reasons that drive 250 million people around the world to leave their countries. We're looking very specifically at people defined as refugees by the UN system. That's what we are looking at when we look at this graphic. The second graphic I wanted to show you, and you won't be surprised given the focus that's been put on this over the last couple of years, is something about Europe's so-called refugee crisis. And let me use this slide to make a few key points about the refugee crisis. Firstly, it's clearly all about Syria. And let's make no mistake that what's happened in Syria over the last 2 or 3 years has been a tragedy, and a large number, a half of Syria's population has been displaced either inside or outside the country. So a real focus on Syria when we think about what's happened in Europe over the last couple of years. When you look at the dots, the people moving, it is quite clear that a large number of people have indeed moved to Europe. We shouldn't disguise that. We have historic highs of people arriving, of refugees and asylum seekers arriving in Europe, and that's why I think Europe has responded in the way that it has. There's been something of a crisis around the way that Europe has responded. But I think this graph also helps us to adopt some perspective about Europe's so-called refugee crisis. Where are the majority of Syrians moving? They're clearly not moving to Europe. They're clearly not moving to Germany and Sweden and the other countries that we read about. They are clearly here. They're in Lebanon, they're in Jordan, they're in Turkey. These are poor countries. These are countries facing demographic challenges, water challenges. They're already relatively underdeveloped, and here they are bearing the massive burden of Syrian refugees. It's not a European crisis, it's a crisis of the region, and I think it's easy to forget that. Something else on perspective. While this is taking place, and while we're concerned about Syria, and while we're concerned about these relatively modest flows, I would argue, to Europe, there's still plenty of other flows going on in other parts of the world that we've largely ignored. The ongoing challenges between Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran. Look at this in sub-Saharan Africa that we've largely forgotten because we're so focused and so obsessed with Europe's so-called refugee crisis. Look at the numbers of people moving through Northern Africa, across the Sahara Desert, taking great risks, and then crossing the Mediterranean to arrive in Europe. And let me give you the figures. In 2015, 4,000 people drowned in the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe for safety. What's happened between 2015 and 2016, I think, is a very interesting fact to reflect on. 2015, we had something like 1 million refugees arriving in Europe. Again, a large number of people, but nothing as compared to what's going on in the region. And before we get too carried away, 1 million people arriving in a continent of 500 million people, arriving in the wealthiest single market in the world, I think we need to get a grip. I don't think this is a number of people that we should really have governments falling over, the EU in crisis about, and so on and so forth. 2015 to 2016, that number has reduced by 2/3. In 2016, only around 300,000 people arrived in Europe. Why? Because of the EU-Turkey deal, because we built walls across Central Europe and the Balkans as well. However, the number of people drowning in the Mediterranean increased between 2015 and 2016. Europe's policies have stemmed the flows, but they haven't stemmed the bloodshed. And I think that's a very important message to convey.
As you see, one of the powerful things about this kind of representation is that each dot represents a story, a tragic story in its own right. But I'd like to take you a couple of steps further back, because behind each of these individual stories lies a complex set of stories about developments that give rise to why people become refugees, why they are forced to flee. If you go back to Syria, and somewhere around 2009, 2010 and 2011, Syria actually faced a sustained period of drought. Part of that drought led initially to over 1 million people being forced to leave rural areas and move into cities, and therefore created, already in a stressed country with governance challenges, conflicts and tensions, also an explosive potential for a great number of people suddenly having lost everything and having to fend in different settings for their livelihoods. When you have governance weakness and when you have insecurity, then very often some of these drivers that may not be visible in the immediate sense may actually trigger the conditions under which conflict then becomes one of the possible outcomes. So the story of Syria and refugees is also a story of not having recognized that dislocation, in this case through extreme weather events, was a contributing factor. And I explicitly say contributing factor because behind every refugee crisis lies a complex web of developments. Very interesting case is also Sudan. If you look at rainfall patterns in Sudan over the last 100 years, there is actually a very clear pattern of both reduced rainfall and, as a result of that, an impact on where people were able to live, whether they were pastoralists or agriculturalists. We have seen in the Sudan over an extended period, with a growing population and greater pressure on water and land resources, people being forced to move into each other's traditional territories. Where you have ethnic tension, where government is not able to mediate these pressure points, very quickly conflict over resources can turn into ethnic conflict, and then it becomes part of the very sad story also of what has unfolded in the Sudan. This repeats itself in many cases also across the whole Sahel, and if we go back to, for instance, Mali, much of the antecedents that have led both to the conflicts within Mali can be traced back to the combination of poverty and also resource degradation. More people, the basic resources that people need for their livelihoods under stress, resulting in dislocation, insecurity, ultimately conflict, and then produces the inevitable outcome, which is that people usually then at the end of a gunpoint are forced to flee. And only then does actually the international refugee law kick in. And therefore I would like to just echo what Khalid said. One of my roles is also to be the envoy of the Platform for Disaster Displacement, which is looking at an ever-growing number of people, whether internally displaced or in future also increasing displaced because they no longer have the living conditions. Whether you want to call them climate refugees, environmental refugees, ecological migrants, the terminology at the moment is not what is essential. It is to comprehend the scale of the problem of looking at the multiple driving forces that are creating the stress points in societies that are often economically very ill prepared to cope with it, and where their governance systems are also not able to absorb these shocks.
What we can do is overlay refugee flows on all sorts of other trends and processes. And what we've done here is to map for you deaths by terrorism and violent extremist events around the world. Look at New York. Did you see that flash? That's 9/11. The number of deaths around the world caused by violent extremism and terrorism, and the map, I think, in itself is very interesting. Let's overlay that, if we could, with the refugee flows. Certainly in many European countries, and certainly in North America and the USA in particular at the moment, there is a feeling amongst some of the public, amongst some of the media, even amongst some politicians, that by allowing refugees and asylum seekers into our countries, we risk importing extremism and terrorism. I think that's a myth. There are very few examples of migrants or asylum seekers or refugees arriving in countries to perpetrate terrorism or perpetrate violent extremism. What this map begins to indicate is that there is indeed a link between violent extremism and migration. What is it? People are fleeing the effects of violent extremism. They're not coming to our countries to perpetrate it, they are fleeing it. And that, I think, is very clear already from this broad correlation that you can see from this map. Another risk is where we leave lots of young men, and it often is men, in refugee camps for 30 years, and they feel disenfranchised, and they feel marginalized, and they feel hopeless, and they have no future, and they have no jobs. Guess what? They become angry. Guess what? A few of them may become radicalized. Guess what? There may be some hotbeds of extremism and terrorism within those refugee camps. We need to find new and innovative solutions to refugee camps. And the final point I'd make on this, and it's a very sensitive discussion, I think we really need to focus downstream. A lot of the work that Achim is doing is focusing upstream. What's going on in Syria? How can we stabilize Syria? How can we protect people closer to their homes? We know that there's 1 million people in places like Germany at the moment. We've got to get their integration right. If we get their integration right, they will build the new Germany. They will make sure that Germany continues to be the preeminent social, cultural, economic force in Europe. If we get it wrong, then in 20 years' time, don't be surprised if there's marginalized Syrian youth and their descendants who are becoming radicalized, who are finding themselves in ghettos, who are unemployed, and who are posing risks and challenges rather than opportunities. I think there's an important message there. What you see here is temperature-rise at the bottom, from 0 through 1, over to 4 degrees. Now, you'll know there's a big debate about how quickly climate change is taking place, how quickly the atmosphere is warming up. It is happening, it's clear it's happening. There are some skeptics somewhere in the world, but they're wrong. It clearly is happening, and it's clearly being driven by anthropomorphic, man-made events. What do these rises in temperature mean for sea level rises? Just have a look at Bangladesh. This is Bangladesh. Look what happens. What you're looking at is a country disappearing under the sea, and not just a small country, a very significant political country with 100 million people or so. It's not just Bangladesh. Let's look at Florida. Look what happens to Florida with a fairly modest rise in sea level. You better find new places to retire to if you're a US citizen, because this is certainly coming in the next 50 to 100 years. Now, the question is, what does climate change mean for displacement? I think what most experts agree is the following. It's not an automatic relationship. Climate change doesn't have to mean that you leave your home. You may be able to stay and adapt. You may be able to adopt new cropping patterns. You may be able to reclaim land, as of course Netherlands has. Probably unlikely in poor countries such as Bangladesh, but don't assume it necessarily means migration and displacement. There are other alternatives. Some will move across borders locally where they can, but there's a fence already being built between India and Bangladesh to make sure that these people can't move into India, and some clearly will move longer distances. So I think we need to move away from the idea that climate change is going to somehow flood Europe with millions of sub-Saharan Africans. What climate change is going to do is to mean that the burden of displacement continues to fall on poor countries neighbouring the areas where climate change is taking place. There's a real legal challenge around this stuff. The 1951 Convention, which is what we use to define refugees today, very clearly does not include the environment as a cause for displacement. These people are not refugees. The term climate refugee is wrong. It's a legal anomaly. These people are not defined as refugees. In most of your countries at the moment, these people would probably be defined as illegal migrants and be deported. It's clear that the international system needs to respond quickly. We need a definition, we need some categories, we need a convention, we need to find ways to protect and assist these people, because it's happening and it's coming, and I think it's coming swiftly.
This is not just for prime ministers or for intelligence services. The responsibility to understand the magnitude and the scale of some of these developments actually rests with each one of us. And wherever we operate, we are part of public opinion. We have the opportunity to make this a topic that will not in 10 years' time again be declared as a surprise, which is very often how we rationalize failures of our societies, of our governments, or indeed of international cooperation. If you look at this map, and back to Khalid's point, we now know from scientists that the initial estimate of the IPCC of a sea level rise of up to 1 meter in the course of this century is rapidly being overtaken by the latest science. Again, modeling this complex planet is never going to be a straightforward issue, but we are intelligent human beings. We can rationalize how we manage risk. If the risk is that we may actually face sea level rise in the range of 1 to 2 meters by the end of this century, then look at this map for a moment, relate that to the fact that much of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coastal zones, and have a look at what is actually being affected. Nothing is inevitable, but what is likely to emerge is that in many countries the capacity to cope with people who are permanently displaced from their home, from their ability to earn a living, can create not only physical stress in terms of having to move, the question is, where will they move to? Bangladesh is already one of the densely populated countries of the world. Its capacity to deal with 1 million, maybe 5 million, maybe 20 million people, because this is what the graphic would imply, of people who have to move, raises fundamental concerns about national security, viability. And you know, the borders between India and Bangladesh already have fences in order to prevent people from actually crossing the border. So climate change and many of the phenomena associated with it, coupled with pressures and also the economic stress, create a situation where we are going to face more and more people who are forced by circumstance to leave. Where will they leave to? Natural disasters alone between the year 2008 and 2015 displaced over 200 million people. That's almost half of Europe having essentially had to leave. We are confronted with both a challenge in the international community on how to manage this, but we also need to begin to understand that this is not something that is mysterious or cannot be understood. We are in the global situation space. We have the information today as to what is likely to be a risk in the future. The world is woefully unprepared, and as Khalid pointed out, our capacity to deal with refugees already as we know today is woefully inadequate. In Dadaab, in Kenya, one of the largest refugee camps in the world, there are girls being born to mothers who were born to mothers in the refugee camp. This is a tragedy, not only in terms of social alienation, in terms of entrapment, but it also speaks to our incapacity in a world of 7 and soon 8, 9 billion people to recognize that we have to live with one another on this planet. And if we do not relate our human condition, notions of solidarity, to these kinds of early warning indicators, then failure is an inevitable outcome.